I now invite our dignitaries to the dais. Dr. Junaid Ahmed, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, and Mr. Niranjan Rajadhaksha. Thank you. Dr. Vijay Kelkar, a Punekar and a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley, retired as chairman of the 13th Finance Commission of India in the rank of Union Cabinet Minister. He was an executive director at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, overseeing its operations in South Asia between 2000 and 2002. He has also held several other key senior positions in the Government of India, namely Secretary to the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Advisor to the Minister of Finance, Finance Secretary, Chairman Tariff Commission, and Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. For his outstanding contribution and service to the nation, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian award in 2011. Thank you, sir, for being here today. Mr. Niranjan Rajadhaksha is executive editor of The Mint, a respected business news daily in India. He is a trustee and ombudsman of the Takshashila Institution and member of the academic board of the MDAE, the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics, based in Mumbai. He teaches contemporary Indian economics in the GCPP program. He is the author of The Rise of India, Its Transformation from Poverty to Prosperity. He has headed the finance and economics coverage in the business world since 1993 and writes 2 columns, Capital Ideas and Econishad. We welcome you, sir. I now request Dr. Kelkar to introduce our speaker, Dr. Junaid Ahmed.
Thank you, Shilpa. You know, I told so many times my PISA colleague, she's my PISA colleague, that first I don't require introduction in our function. And if at all you want to introduce me, just introduce me as I'm married to Rahul Dravid's sister. That's more impressive. And it's unadulterated pleasure, a delight to introduce my friend Junaid Ahmed this evening. Junaid is the country director of the World Bank in India. He is probably the youngest country director in India, for the World Bank in India. He was earlier chief of staff of the World Bank Group President. He joined World Bank after his bachelor's at Brown, then master's at Harvard, and then his PhD at Stanford University. He joined in 1991 as a young professional, and then worked in different divisions of Africa, Eastern Europe, and infrastructure divisions. And before he joined the President's office, he was director of World Global Practice. He also spent 10 years in the field, including South Africa, and now this prompts me to speak on a personal note. I first had the pleasure of meeting Junaid because he was part of, at least I thought, Gang of Two, him and Shekhar Shah, who is now Director General of NCER, to really bring totally new perspective in the World Bank in the field of water, urbanization, and solid waste and sanitation. And I remember several times meeting him, and I really learned a lot. And this is the first time, at least I'm aware, he made me aware the importance of institutional reforms. And I think it's worthwhile later on we should look at what he and his colleagues did in South Africa. One of the most important reforms in terms of democratic decentralization took place when he was working in South Africa. But I'm not going to reveal, I'm going to reveal one more secret about Junaid. You know, our distinguished Prime Minister of India does not like economists. But the most favorite economist in Delhi is Junaid, for Prime Minister. And probably the only economist I've seen him. I've seen myself. So as they say, "Aankhon se kahal," I've seen myself. There a great sort of attention. He listens to him and he sort of respects Junet's views. So he's one of very, very few economists. Anytime you want to convey any ideas to Prime Minister, you know where to go. And he has agreed to speak today on a very important subject for us, which is current global turmoil in global economy, what it means to our region, and including our country. So now I'll request and hand over the proceedings to our chairman of this evening, Nirendra Radhaksha.
Thank you, Dr. Kelkar. Without much ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Junaid Ahmed to the dais, please.
Namaskar, good evening. I must say, I'm really nervous before a presentation, but to present in front of Dr. Kelkar is a challenge for all of us. And I was telling, in fact, I was talking with my wife who's in Washington, D.C. I said, you know, this is one presentation that I really have to think through, because I have someone who I cannot explain to you how much I respect in terms of what he has done, not only for India, but for South Asia. So I'm very grateful for the invitation that you have given for me to come here. And thank you very much to all of you for joining me. Thank you very much to the chair for giving me this space. So I've decided not to really present a lecture per se, but maybe have a dialogue with you. And the dialogue is, if you will, a series of thoughts in which I would like to make a case. And the case basically is that if you are in South Asia and if you're in India and you're thinking about the global prospects and global challenges that this country and this region faces, then look inwards a little bit. That perhaps the challenges lie not externally, but internally. And that if shifts happen internally, this is a country and a region that can take on the challenges externally. That's sort of the punchline, if you will, that what I would like to try and convince you of. I'm from Bangladesh. I grew up there, and a lot of my roots and my learning comes from my father, who was a government officer in Bangladesh. He retired as the chairman of Tariff Commission. He was one of the sort of the founders of the country, played a big political role. So a lot of my sense of looking at state and state changes comes from his perspective when he told me, learn to see the world that you will work in through the eyes of the state. And yet most of my academic training was learn to see the world through the eyes of markets. So I've tried to combine the two. But today what I will do is I'm going to move between global issues and country issues and slowly try to make the connections between the two. So let me begin with perhaps a country context. And let me begin with India. The past several years, we've been working with the Energy Efficiency Services Limited Agency of India. This is the company, government company, corporatized, whose basic job is to try to promote energy efficiency in the country. And what this corporate body has done is it's decided that it's going to use the scale of India to drive the prices of LED lights down. So as a public corporate agency, it went out and it procured LED lights. It procured LED lights and it turned to municipalities and said, we will put these lights in your municipalities and with the savings that you have, you can pay me back. Right? Interestingly, in procuring LED lights in its scale in India, it drove the prices of LED lights completely. What started out as a market of about 15,000, 20,000 LED lights, today is a market of about 25 million LED lights. What turned out as very few private companies in the energy efficiency world, you now have several private companies working in India on energy efficiency. The example that I'm giving you here is an example to show how a government corporatized entity using the scale of India is driving a reform process in India, which is creating markets. This shift towards creating bankable institutions. Why do I say bankable institutions? Is because we are now, from the World Bank, have been able to take EESL into the capital markets. With a risk wrap, a risk guarantee, it now gets access to capital markets with long tenure, and it continues to open markets for the private sector. Its next series of interventions are going to be on energy efficient air conditioners, energy efficient fans, etc. This is quite a massive shift in using a state-owned enterprise and holding it against market benchmarks to drive change in the country. That's one example. Let me give you another example much closer to your own city. We've been investing in Mumbai, in the Mumbai Urban Transport Program. And basically what we do is we fund commuter railway lines to connect households to where jobs are. And in urban complexes, that's a very important connectivity story. So when we started doing MUTP 1, it was the first line, then we did the second line, and now we're being asked to do a third line. And what happens is basically we create a line of credit, and an entity called MRVC takes the line of credit and it creates the infrastructure. Then it hands over the infrastructure to Indian Railways, Western and Central, to run the lines. Now, what you have here is a very interesting story. Unlike EESL, which is one corporate agency which is both responsible for investment and operations, here you have someone who invests in the infrastructure and someone else who operates. It's what I call the classic example of split personality, and it's one of the weakest ways of actually doing infrastructure. I build, you operate. So when I build, I will gold plate it any way I want because I don't have the incentive of managing the operation. When you talk to Indian Railways, they will tell you, we're not interested in commuter railway. We're interested in freight. We're interested in long distance passenger. This thing we have to subsidize, right? We're not that interested, but we're being forced to operate it. When you ask the city of Mumbai, what do you think about this? They say, you know, this track of line is completely critical for us because it brings the workers into the city, but we have absolutely no control over it. So now that Government of India is asking us to invest in a third line in the commuter railway, MUTP, I've proposed a slightly different model. I have said, what if we take MRVC and we take the part of Indian Railways that does the operations and maintenance, bring them together and create India's first commuter railway company, which then can go to the markets to borrow and actually operate a commuter railway. In addition, why not have this company co-owned by the city of Maharashtra, of Mumbai, the state of Maharashtra, and a portion with private sector, and in fact, even give shares to the workers. It completely changes the incentive of this public corporation. This example I'm giving to you is, I believe, that a huge growth potential of India and indeed across South Asia lies in the rethinking of institutions of service delivery and to move away from project mode to creating bankable institutions, to make institutions that can go into the capital markets. And here a very big difference is, I'm not talking about giving something to the private sector and creating a private company. I'm talking about public corporatized companies that can be made creditworthy and be held accountable by markets, but yet be accountable to citizens for service delivery. The world's most efficient and largest water utility is Sabesp. It's in Brazil, Sao Paulo. It raises its money from the US capital markets. It's a completely government corporatized agency, arm's length from government, where infrastructure investment and operation are held by one company and accountable for it, credit rated. I think that if you look at India, you will find that from water utilities to energy distribution companies to transport companies, that this fundamental shift towards creating efficient, bankable institution is probably one of the most important sources of economic growth that can drive the future of India. Unless that happens, India will not be able to capture the global growth path that it needs. And in particular, these institutions feed into one of the biggest changes that's happening in India, which is the creation of an internal one market through the GST. For the first time, there is a potential that India's every single state becomes one market, and that creates huge growth paths. Dr. Kelkar, who through the GST reforms and in promoting that as one of the original thinkers of moving along this way, the work that Dr. Kelkar and his team did at that time suggested that at a static level, GDP growth would increase by 2% if you could get this integrated market happening. Well, today we are working with government to ask the question, where do you invest in freight and logistics to actually capture the benefits of a one united market under one tax regime? And the answer here lies, unleash the type of institutions that will drive logistics and multimodal transport. You have the freight corridors that have been created. The freight corridors are in theory being run under a corporate body. It's not yet fully corporate. But the freight corridor, and the one that comes through UP and Bihar and lands up in West Bengal, once you have finished this freight corridor, it's going to land up in West Bengal and create congestion. The West Bengal port, the container systems there cannot handle what's going to come. You actually need to unleash the city of West Bengal to become, in effect, a port city of a modern era. Right? A multimodal system has to be created. Another example of the type of institutions that are needed to unleash the economic growth path. These are the type of internal investments that need to be done to prepare India to really move into the global markets. So let me pause now a little bit from the internal story, and let me go a little bit to the global markets, and then I'll come back to the internal story. On the global market story, very interesting, South Asia as a region is not that integrated to global markets. South Asia as a region is not that integrated internally to each other either. Basically, if you look at the percentage of exports over GDP and imports over GDP from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, these are not nations that you would say are highly globally integrated. At the same time, thank you. At the same time, if you look at the growth path of the last few years, and the growth has been pretty extraordinary. We just finished a 50-year analysis of growth of India, and we finished a 15-year growth analysis of Bangladesh. The India story is fascinating. If you take a 50-year look, you find a steady growth, a steady acceleration of growth. One. Two, you find a stable growth. That means the variation around the mean has become smaller. It's a stable growth path. Three, it's a diversified growth. As opposed to a China that's very much an export-led, India is a combination of investment, albeit driven by government, consumption, and export. So it's a much more diversified growth path. And finally, it's a resilient growth path. The shocks that happened recently, both in terms of demonetization and implementation of GST, we now see the growth coming back. Very few people would have predicted a couple of decades ago that India would have such a stable growth path that would be continuing to accelerate. 7% growth rate for a nation of this size is quite powerful. Bangladesh, 15 years of growth, average around 6%. It's now beginning to break the 8% barrier. And there too, it's been a growth that has been steady and stable. But both these growth paths are driven far more by internal systems than necessarily external. Though Bangladesh is more external because of the garment export that it had, but we mustn't underestimate and the remittance flows that came from workers that were exported. One must not underestimate the internal rural economy that's been driving Bangladesh's growth rate. So you have two economies, two giant economies of the region that I would say is not as integrated as others and is far more inward dependent. Now what that means is it's an economy that if it begins to capture greater efficiency internally, it will continue its growth path. Hence the stories that I told you of creating bankable institutions. But it also has interesting implications for today's global context. In today's global context, basically, there are three shocks that the region is facing. And these three shocks basically are interest rates are starting to increase in advanced economies. Oil prices are bouncing back from the lows of a couple of years ago. Though if you notice the markets in the last 2 days, oil prices have come down. And third is there's a prospect of trade war, or at least higher tariffs, which is very real, in particular in terms of the disruptions that might emerge between China and the US. So the question is, in the global prospects, if these are the type of shocks that are emerging, what does it mean for economies that have been growing more through internal base rather than global base? Well, interestingly here, I think we have we're seeing some important lessons. First, in terms of the higher interest rates, I think the real challenge is to be steady in terms of macroeconomic management and to avoid any kind of a rupee crisis. And it means greater fiscal discipline is needed because interest rates are going to keep on moving. And it probably means a far more careful management and controlled depreciation of the rupee. But there is nothing here that says sudden shifts in the macroeconomy of any of these nations in South Asia is needed because of these interest rate shifts. In terms of the oil, very interesting, here we are noticing our analysis shows that all the South Asian countries, and in particular India, has become less energy intensive, less oil intensive, that is beginning to make a shift into alternative energy. And it's also a country that has begun to create, if you will, a bit of an implicit carbon tax in the way it's put excise taxes on fuel and the way it's put cess on coal. It's very tempting at a time when there is pressure on oil prices to let go of that. And I think the lesson we have learned from other parts of the world is to continue the path of sustainability rather than using oil prices to give short-term boost in growth. So then the third issue, which is the trade war, potential trade war, quote unquote. I have to be very careful as a World Banker not to start talking about trade wars. Those are two very big shareholders that we have. So what I'm about to say, you will perhaps not repeat that a World Banker said it. Perhaps you could just say a Bangladeshi said it. That may be safer. But we've been doing some modeling of the type of tariff shifts that may emerge between China and the US. And what we're seeing is a potential of trade diversion into South Asia. That these tariff shifts may actually allow South Asia to break into US and European markets in a more powerful way. But you're not going to break into these markets if your freight institutions don't work, if your multimodal corridors don't work, and you will not break into these markets if, and I go now back to the domestic story, if the optimal size of firms in India does not grow. Today in India, firms are too small. They enter small and they remain small. In many ways, it's the regulatory framework, whether it's direct regulation or labor, that gives incentives to firms not to grow, that to remain a certain size. But this size is not of the optimal size that will help you break into export markets. So again, the connection between global prospects and internal change is that if trade diversion is going to happen, you will have to invest not only in the infrastructure and the institutions that manage infrastructure, but you have to look at firm capability and how firms may indeed grow and enter this global market. So potentially, the tariff issues that are emerging globally may allow South Asia and new markets to enter. However, there is a caveat. And the caveat is that if these trade shifts have a second round effect on economic growth, then South Asia will be in trouble, because South Asia depends on growth in Europe and US in terms of its own growth. If the growth in US and Europe fall, then I think you will see South Asia being as much a victim of these kind of disruption as other countries. But perhaps this is the natural, if you will, budget constraint on the type of conflict that might emerge. How far will political leaders in other countries take a tariff war if it begins to affect their own growth? And I think that will be the interesting political economy issue to consider. So fundamentally, yes, there's a lot of disruptions potentially out there in the global market, but if India focuses and South Asia focuses on internal shifts in creating institutions of service delivery and creates emphasis on firm capability, it can capture the trade diversion that emerges. And that's the connection between internal and external that I think is extremely important. Let me talk about one more very important internal issue that I think is very worrisome. It's the whole issue of labor force participation of women. We are seeing, let me step back. Usually what you see as an economy grows and income increases, you see employment, unemployment rates fall, labor force participation, unemployment falls, and then as the economy increases, it increases again. It's a U curve. If you map South Asian countries against this U-curve, you will find that it is below the potential of each of these countries. So India is well below where it should be in the employment given its income level. And then if you unbundle it between men and women, what you find that from a perspective of men, they're plus minus on that international curve. When it comes to women, they're dramatically below the curve. Right? This is a serious issue. Why is it that, that women are leaving the labor market? We know that women leave the labor market with economic growth for a variety of reasons. One is certainly when you get opportunities of higher income, you move in for investing in your human capital. So you go to school, your girls are kept in school and so on. That's a positive, right? However, we're seeing a far deeper drop, and there's a sense that this relates to the nature of the job, the security in public space that needs to be dealt with, childcare facilities. And if this area is not dealt with, then a whole issue of economic growth will in fact be affected in India and in South Asia. Interestingly, Bangladesh, where garment industry is led by women workers, even in Bangladesh, labor force participation of women is not at the international level given its income that it should be. And I think for South Asia, this is something extremely important to address. The final point I'd like to make from an internal perspective is something that, well, two points. Something that I think South Asia and in particular India needs to look at is natural resource management. From a perspective of land availability and water availability, it is far less per person, per economic unit than a Brazil and a China. And yet, if you look at the way India manages water, it is one of the most inefficient water managers in the world. This is serious. Your groundwater depletion, your cities in terms of, and in face of urbanization, what it should be getting, this is a major issue. Here, the spectrum of challenges are huge. It's about ownership of water, who owns water, and therefore who has an incentive to manage it, the challenge of common goods. Second is coming up with mechanisms in which water can be shifted from agriculture into higher value use, such as municipal, industrial, and commercial. Right? Today, about 90% of water is in agriculture. Right? How do you make this shift? And you know that the linkage, the nexus between agriculture, water, and electricity. Punjab, for example, is a major case where electricity subsidy is completely driving groundwater below sustainability. This will impact on economic growth in a big way. And in a context where you can capture global prospects, this will be a major dampener. On the land side is linked to urbanization. Land being brought into urbanization and land value capture is something that India has not done as well as China. And I think that this is going to be another area that, that India will need to look internally in order to position itself globally. And I guess the final point that I want to make, and one that I've been working a lot on, is the whole issue of urban management. I don't know how to say this, but I guess I'll say it directly. India and South Asia have the worst managed cities in the world. Why? Because you cannot answer the question, who is responsible for the management of cities and towns in India? We know the mayor of New York. I have no clue who the mayor of Delhi is, right? Because it doesn't matter who the mayor of Delhi is. I don't know who the mayor of Dhaka is because the real mayor of Dhaka is the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. Right? The management and governance of cities is central to to the economic growth of urbanizing economies. Right? And here, there are two paradigms of urban growth around the world. One paradigm is 74th Amendment. You elect mayors, you give them the powers, and you hold them accountable for managing cities. And they manage land, they manage service delivery, and they are responsible to their citizens. The other model of urban management is state-appointed city managers. China is a perfect example. Chinese managers are appointed, but they run cities as state managers. What's common between these two models of a city manager and mayor? They completely control the dynamic of the city. They run its services, they run its tax systems, they are accountable. In South Asia, you have a complete fragmentation of governance of urban systems. You have mayors, you have city municipal commissioners, you have divisional commissioners, you have development agencies, and now you have, in the context of smart cities, special purpose vehicles. This fragmentation does not allow you to manage cities in an integrated way. Cities have to be looked at as open macroeconomies, and you can't run macroeconomies in a fragmented way. The reason I focus on this in a context of global prospects and growth is if South Asia does not get its cities to run in an effective way, it will not sustain growth in the future. Right? Now, I do say this with one caveat, that cities continue to create economies of scale and economies of agglomeration that are stronger than all the diseconomies that you see, from air pollution to traffic congestion. So there are those who say it doesn't matter, because the power of cities to bring labor markets together just keep you moving on. But in reality, at some point, it's not the growth of existing cities, but the loss of growth from inefficient cities that will drive the national growth story. And I think that in the world of today, global prospects will be determined by how much cities are able to support economic activities. What you may know is that there is greater dialogue between mayors around the world than there is between prime ministers and presidents around the world. I was absolutely fascinated that the mayor of New Orleans has visited Dhaka city several times, for the simple reason, he said, we got flooded once. You in Dhaka city, you get flooded every year. How do you manage the floods? This dialogue between mayors is driving a lot of the economic changes in countries that have empowered their mayors. And one nation that has empowered its mayors through the city manager route is China. You climb up the Politburo only if you deliver at the city level. The mayor of Beijing, because of his impact on controlling air pollution, today is the Minister of Environment. That's how close that correlation is. And I think that the future of how nations like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan will link to global prospects will be determined by how it runs its city. So basically, my presentation to you really has one punchline, that for South Asia that is not fully integrated in global systems, the path of global integration offers a lot of opportunities, but it can only take advantage of that is if it makes moves internally in the type of institutions of service delivery, in how it manages natural resources, how it enables firm capability to grow, and in particular, how it opens the door for labor force participation of women. That's the connection between the domestic economy and its shifts and taking advantage of the global prospects. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for a wonderful lecture which connected so many different things and brought it together in this larger narrative about how India is positioned in the coming years. So we'll have a short round of questions and answers right now. My only request is that so that we can get more questions in and sort of more people can ask Dr. Ahmed what they want to. Please keep the questions very short and to the point.
Ahmed Saab, I wish I could agree with your very persuasive presentation. Incidentally, I work on issues of water. My name is H.M. Desarda. I earned my bread teaching economics, I hope, legitimately, because, I work with communities. Problem is that this whole obsession with the growth is something that South Asia and India cannot afford. And mind you, because the moment I say this, you would say कि ये ecologist है, ये भद्र लोग नहीं हैं. Problem is that it is not a blind opposition to growth, but opposition to blind growth. And taking that, I have a couple, very quickly I would just express my concern. This whole chronism that has come to South Asia is something which, and one thing I think from the example, Bangladesh garment I have studied very carefully, and for Maharashtra I have submitted a scheme which works on the line from cotton to cloth. That's incidental. The basic point is that unless this whole undifferentiated and undirected growth, which is a carbon neutral, I think basic issue in South Asia is ecology, not economics, and society and community. And from the examples of garment, from the examples of, you talked about the 73rd, 74th Amendment. We are not giving to space to that. Economics and politics of gigantism is ruling South Asia. How can we correct is my one question. And another very quick one. I fully agree with you, not that I disagree, I have decided to disagree, on the issues of water. Natural resource management in South Asia is the key to everything. And if you have to do natural resource management, 19th and 20th century paradigms will not help. We need 21st century paradigm. And 21st century paradigm is there are cheaper, quicker and safer options, and the community is the answer. I think given your job in the World Bank and being a Modi ji's friend, अच्छे दिन कब आएंगे मालूम नहीं, लेकिन ये भद्र लोग वाली बात मुझे लगता है कि अब आम के आम गुठलियों के दाम नहीं चलेंगे. And let us be honest to ourselves.
I'm have to cut you short.
एक sentence,
because we need more questions.
एक वाक्य बोलने दीजिए, एक वाक्य बोलने दीजिए, एक one final sentence. Don't get discomfortable. PIC is a bhadra lok. So, and we are all bhadra.
No, it's a question of time. More people can get their questions
मुझे आप
in.
क्यों disturb? एक line. I think time has come where the public intellectuals in India should not, and South Asia, should not help governments to manufacture the consent, which Chomsky says. Your job in the World Bank probably is doing that. Sorry to be curt, but that is the fact.
We'll take a few more questions. And please, as far as possible, 1 or 2 sentence questions, direct questions.
My name is Dr. Anupam Saraf. I have a very specific question. I think coming from Bangladesh, you definitely appreciate climate change and global warming. So India in its NDC has made specific commitments, and I'm going to talk only about 2. The first one is talking about reducing the carbon intensity of GDP by 30% till 2030. And the second one specifically is increasing the carbon absorption in India by 3 billion tons, again by 2030. So what is the World Bank's initiative specifically to help India accomplish these 2?
I think the lady here.
Hello, Mr. Ahmed. 2 quick questions. What is the impact of federalism in India on integrating service institutions that you just talked about? And secondly, there is work done, if I'm correct, in the World Bank about the impact of the time cost and a woman's labor force participation. So I was wondering how in a country where our economy is increasingly male breadwinner driven, do we reduce the time cost of a woman's domestic care? Thanks.
We'll first finish this round and then perhaps.
So let me start with the last question. The issue of federalism and service delivery, I think, is extremely central to the whole story of India, and in several ways. For example, you take a lot of the different ways of looking at it. One is simply to start off by saying what powers have been given to panchayats, what powers have been given to urban local bodies. There are services that are closer to citizens. Do they have control over those services? And I think that for a long time there was a sense that that could be driven centrally, but there's more of a sense that if federalism truly were allowed to evolve in India, that you would get different states through their own political economy choosing to empower local bodies far more. That's one example. The other example would be the whole nature of the technical decentralization. Often you will find that water is being run by a state as opposed to run by a local body. So moving that to a local arena, or splitting regulation, leaving it at the state level, but putting service delivery at the service level. So you're seeing this across India through different services, and I think that this will continue to be a driving question. But ultimately, for me, the emergence of a stronger federation of India probably will allow far more innovation and diversification in service delivery than if it were driven by central systems. I was sharing with some of the colleagues of the Institute here. I think that this time has come for India to relook at its centrally sponsored schemes. I think that many of the centrally sponsored schemes drive a top-down mechanism of delivery rather than feeding into the federalism story. On the time cost, absolutely. Water is the big story. If you want to drive down the time cost on women and girls, certainly water delivery is probably the most important entry point. And I think the other one that we are now seeing is childcare. The mechanism of childcare and how it links to employment opportunities will have a radically big impact on time story. But what's interesting is sometimes we find interventions that we didn't expect to have an impact are having an impact. The whole arrival of electricity is changing the nature of household chores and what time effect it has on the gender allocation. Similarly, in Bangladesh, very interesting, for a long time, we wanted sanitation to grow, and we had successes, but a big success happened when we began to give scholarship to girls to attend schools, and then money would go to bank accounts and kept in the name of the girl if she could finish the school, and also if the families ensured that the girl was not married before a certain age. Secondly, schools were given vouchers if they could attract girls into the school. You know what happened? The biggest boom on toilets we have ever seen. Toilets for girls became the way schools attracted girls to their. So there are different mechanisms which will affect the whole issue of time cost. The carbon intensity and carbon absorption. So two answers to that. One is this year, the World Bank's program in India has become the largest program of the World Bank globally. This year we were able to lend $3.5 billion. But what's interesting is our board asks us to document what percentage of that of our lending delivers climate co-benefits. So we have a whole methodology for measuring it. The corporate target we have for this year in the bank is 28%. Next year is 35%, and the following year will be 40%. This year, the portfolio of India, of the World Bank, climate co-benefit is 60%, right? And this is extraordinary. It's not only the largest program, it is the largest climate co-benefit program in all of the World Bank, and I would guarantee across all of the multilaterals. And we're doing it because we're involved in renewable energy, we're involved in forest management, we're involved in groundwater management, we're involved in energy efficiency. So from adaptation to mitigation in all of them. You know, the price of solar has come down, and the bank has played a big role in helping create the bidding process that created the historically low prices for solar power. So we're completely, I would say our portfolio is a sustainable development portfolio for India. The first question, there are a lot of issues there, and I think the one that I will address is, I agree with you. It's not about growth blindly, right? We know that growth can be jobless growth. We know growth can be creating inequality. So the nature of growth is very important. And that's why in any type of work that we do, we look at how rural economies engage in that growth path. We look at the issues of inequality while we're working on growth. But I have to say to you that no nation in the world has reduced poverty without being in a growth path. Even at the end of the day, we only focused on growth, we would still have a huge impact that we would not have on poverty without growth. But your point of blind growth is, we need to be careful, absolutely. From creation of jobs, ensuring inequality doesn't happen, and we know what that means. And we know how government needs to spend money in a growth path to ensure inequality doesn't happen. And I can assure you that that's a conversation that we have with government almost constantly.
No, I'm sorry, sir. We'll have to, no. I'll have two more questions. Yeah. No, sir, you have to respect the chair, please. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My question is regarding firm capability building, which you talked about. So what is the current situation in India, and what can firms like I have a firm, so what firms over here can do, looking down upwards, and World Bank's involvement in all these things?
The lady there. Just one last question. We have to maintain gender balance.
So my question is basically about the employment of women in the country. So as you said that the employment rate has to increase in the country for women especially, and for that the nature and security and all of the other things that come with all the childcare facilities and everything that comes with employment of women have to improve. But I have this problem where women are not employed in companies because companies are disincentivized to employ women in the first place, because they have to take care of all these facilities and they have to invest in all of the infrastructure that is required. So how does the World Bank think about tackling such issues in countries like India, where people are not motivated to, even invest in the infrastructure that is required for women to work properly in workplaces?
Okay. Just very quick question, because it's absolutely the last one.
My name is Manish. Today only I read the article about that India is now the 6th largest economy in the world. This ranking have been given by the World Bank. I would like to know more about how World Bank gives this kind of rankings, only on the basis of number, or else other things. With regard, also IMF is also included into that list. So I would like to ask, how are your indicators indicating the economy?
So we actually didn't do any ranking. All IMF did was it took the latest GDP figures and listed the GDP figures, and India happens to be above France. And if you do a PPP calculation of it, I think India is already the third largest country in the world. But I assure you there's no formal ranking or anything. It's just simply GDP data that we collect and it was put there. And naturally, if Bangladesh became the sixth largest, I'd expect newspapers in Bangladesh to also say sixth largest. So that's all it is. Nothing more. Firm capability. So this is an area that we're just beginning to look at, and what we're discovering is firm capability comes from many different angles. One is firm capability because of the regulatory challenges you face. Firm capability because your ability to access land, your ability to access electricity and so on. And a lot of our work is based on trying to figure out how to improve regulatory frameworks so that small firms can grow. Then there is the whole access to finance. How can one improve access to finance? But lately what we've been doing is working on the skills side. And with the skills ministry, and there's an extraordinary secretary, KP Krishnan, who's really looking at district level analysis of the sources of economic growth, what type of firms exist, an analysis of the type of constraints the firms are facing, and then investing in private sector training facilities and so on to support the firms. This is a growing area in India, and in fact, a lot of African nations are coming to India to actually take a look at how this whole skilling story is working. On the women's informal, women's labor force participation, I have to tell you, I'm reading the literature, and I'm convinced that the literature has not given us an effective framework to understand why women's labor force participation grows or falls under what conditions. So there's a real gap. Two, because of that gap, we grasp on the obvious: transport, a child care facility, and we begin to invest in that, or education, skilled education, and so on. Given that, one of the conversations we are having with governments around the world is when an opportunity comes to use women's participation, let's do it. So for example, for the last 5 to 7 years, we've invested in self-help groups of women. What's extraordinary is that 45 million women have been organized into self-help groups, and they have accessed $25 billion from the market, right? This has been an amazing growth at the rural level of women accessing finance and investing in economic activities. There was no theory to that, except we learned from Bangladesh that you could create self-help groups, and that would create empowerment of agency and so on. What we're doing now is we're working with SIDBI to, instead of doing a line of credit of the World Bank to SIDBI, and SIDBI then doing line of credits to microfinance that work with self-help groups, we're helping SIDBI go into the market to float livelihood bonds, livelihood bonds for women, so that markets would begin to actually fund this growing network of microfinance. And what's interesting is there are investors out there that are willing to take a 2%, 3% return if we can ensure that women are getting the money, right? There are impact investors out there. And so we, in fact, think we can reduce the interest rates faced by women from 18, 19% all the way down to 10, 11%. And if you reduce that, what you'll see is women's enterprises will emerge. As opposed to self-help groups, the real growth comes as if you can create women's entrepreneurs. And then once you start investing in women's entrepreneurs, you create networks of women's entrepreneurs. So many of our projects, we're beginning to do that. So with Ministry of Transport, we are in management, in operations and maintenance of highways. We're working with the ministry to create women's companies that will be in charge of managing portions of the highways. But again, as you can see, these are almost ad hoc interventions, because the theory of what it takes to really systematically change labor force participation of women, my own gut is there are some norms that have to change in our societies. You know that you'll be surprised. If I asked you, which is the country that still does not have legislation that prevents child marriage, what countries would you choose? Well, I asked a group of students at a university in Delhi, and they said India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia. That was their set of countries. Do you know that in the United States, 25 states will not allow legislation that will ban child marriages? Kentucky has the highest number of child marriages. How do you deal with such norms? Right? If norms don't change in our society, we're not going to win the game on gender equality. I can guarantee you that. So we hope economics makes a difference, but not always clear.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, on the last issue, we have here Professor Medha Deshpande. She is a professor of economics in a leading women's university in Pune. So I would request Medha to respond, because she has done research on, she's right now conducting research on female participation. Medha, you want to say something?
Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. I have been reading this literature for last 2-3 years when I was preparing the paper for employment conference. And you are right that we don't have a theory to explain the U-shape of female labor force participation rate. We have data problems. That is also important aspect that we have to consider. But norm is really very important aspect that we have to take into consideration, because it all depends on preferences. NSSO's survey, which asks probing questions to women, that would you like to take any opportunity, employment opportunity, would you like to work? They say yes, but given the house, the work is in the household premises. They don't want to go out and work. So definitely women want to supplement the family by earning income, but they are not prepared to go out because of the household responsibilities, and as you said, that they want to invest more in human capital. So really we don't have theory. And why women are going for education? Whether this Klassen has written one paper, he has done, Stephen Klassen. So he says that marriage market is one important aspect that determines education, why women go for education. So we don't have a theory, and I don't think that economists can do much in this area. Sociologists have to, anthropologists and sociologists, they have to do lot of research in this area. Thank you.
I now request the program chair, Mr. Niranjan Rajyadhaksha, to offer his concluding remarks.
First of all, I'd once again like to thank Dr. Ahmed for a very illuminating lecture. he began by saying that he was tense because he had to speak in front of Dr. Kelkar. I have a very similar situation. I have to speak in front of one guru on the stage and one guru here in the audience. But nevertheless, I'll take a shot at some concluding remarks. I think the real two big takeaways is the fact that there is optimism, reason for optimism, and also that India needs to focus on its internal reforms. In fact, just yesterday in the IMF quarterly, I read a profile of Dave Donaldson, who's a young economic historian who won the J.B. Clark Medal this year. And some of his work is on the impact of railways on district GDP. And I think there's one comment in that profile which caught my attention about India, and somebody has said that the gains from removing the restrictions on interstate trade are perhaps at this point of time higher than those of removing of international trade, you know. So the domestic constraints have to be released on trade, and I think again it all goes back to GST and its grand design of integrating the Indian market. So internal reforms, absolutely I agree. I think there is a problem of narrative here. Much of the Indian narrative still tends to get stuck in the 1990s agenda, you know, and I think sometimes newspapers such as mine are guilty of that same crime, that we often describe, you know, some FDI reform as a grand reform, but I think these are now incremental issues. I think the framing the reforms agenda, the internal reforms agenda for the next 15, 20 years is very critical, because that's the window of opportunity India has before the population starts aging. So just a couple of 3-4 points broadly. I think they are parallel to what Dr. Ahmed said. I think one is the entire issue of state capacity, that we talk about the ability of India to innovate, but I think that comes with the implicit assumption that we have the state capacity to do so. And again, the state capacity issue is linked to one, fiscal capacity, the ability of the Indian state to tax efficiently and spend efficiently. Once again, I think the GST would be a big, big event. So if India's tax to GDP ratio were to go up by 2% over the next 10, 15 years, it creates space to provide the sort of public goods which India desperately needs. The second part of the state capacity issue is obviously institutions, which Dr. Ahmed also mentioned. India is going to be radically different in the next 20 years. It will be more urban, more federal, more market-driven. And I don't think we have applied our minds enough to what are the institutional constraints here. You know, some of them are quasi-constitutional. So I think we need to think about that. And so that's one set of issues. Sort of the narrative, then the state capacity issue. The third is actually the ability of India to grow while maintaining macroeconomic stability. India is a very odd country, you know. At some level, we represent Southeast Asia in the sense that we have high rates of savings and investment. But we also represent Latin America in some aspects, in the sense that we are prone to macroeconomic sort of, I wouldn't say crises, but at least macroeconomic scares. We've always been an outlier in terms of fiscal deficits, inflation, and the past few years, you know, it has been no different. So I think the ability to maintain macroeconomic stability while pushing growth, I think, is a very big issue. And the recent attempts to bring in rule-based monetary and fiscal policies are important if India again has to grab its opportunities. And the last point, I completely agree, the natural resource constraints which we have. So be it energy, be it water, be it land use, I think again, not enough of it is sort of brought into the broader reform agenda. You see, a lot of it is discussed as something which is besides the growth agenda. And I think bringing natural resource constraints into the growth dialogue is very important. But in sort of totality, I think the message which Dr. Ahmed has given us, which is the need for internal reforms, and then the ability of India, despite global turbulence, to maintain its growth path are very important. So once again, I'll thank him a lot for speaking here, and thanks to Dr. Kelkar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of the PIC, Dr. Kelkar will now present Dr. Ahmed with a token of our appreciation, including a memento showcasing Pune's rich cultural and historical heritage. Thank you. May I also ask Dr. Kelkar, please, to present Mr. Rajadhaksha with a book on grassroots innovation written by Professor Anil Gupta. Thank you. What a wonderful and informative session this has been. I ask for a moment, please, to thank the many people involved in putting it together and making it a huge success. At the outset, thank you to Dr. Ahmed for sparing the time to come to Pune from Delhi and sharing his views, shedding light on some of the work undertaken by the bank regionally and also within the country. Your observations, sir, on India with its continuous growth and innovation patterns and its potential for global integration while focusing on institution building, amping up service delivery and internal reforms is well noted. Thank you. We look forward to many more engagements with you. Mr. Niranjan Rajadhaksha, thank you so much for chairing today's session and also for your very insightful remarks. Dr. Kelkar, heartfelt thanks for your presence and continued support. We are very grateful to Dr. Rajas Parchure, the director of the Gokhale Institute, and his team for providing this venue and for coordinating the event logistics this evening. Thank you, sir. A very special round of applause, please, for the PIC staff for their untiring efforts and planning that you put in behind every event. I also take the opportunity to thank all the PIC trustees and members for being here today. Students of Gokhale Institute and from elsewhere, no event is complete without your interest and active participation. So many, many thanks. I also thank members of the media for their coverage of this evening's event. And last, but certainly not the least, Punekars and others in the audience, we appreciate your valuable presence and hope to see you again. We come to the end of this program now. Thank you and have a very pleasant evening.